a cold, rainy night, a poor waitress brings a disabled boy into her diner, unaware that he's the son of a billionaire watching from across the street. That simple act of kindness sets off a high-stakes power game, where compassion is tested, reputations are threatened, and the underdog rises to control the board. Baltimore, 11:37 p.m. The dim glow of the streetlights filtered through the stained glass window of the small diner, casting shadows on the sweat-drenched face of Serena Carter, the woman who had just wiped down the last table of her second consecutive shift. It had been a long day, like every other day, but it wasn't enough to turn her bitter or numb, as people often said about servers in rundown places like this. Serena was used to the ache in her legs, the greasy smell clinging to her hair, and the meager tips she received from hurried customers. But one thing she never let herself get used to was turning a blind eye to someone in need. At 28, she lived in a tiny apartment near Fayette Street, where the walls grew moldy in winter and the heater groaned whenever the temperature dipped below 40 degrees. Each month, Serena poured most of her paycheck into rent, the rest going toward her mother's medical bills. Her mother, who had been in a vegetative state for 4 years following a stroke. Her world consisted of cracked streets, forgotten neighborhoods, and dreams put on, old by a harsh reality. But if anyone asked what kept Serena going, it was the memory of her grandmother. The only person who had ever hugged her when she cried after being teased at school, the one who taught her how to make a perfect grilled cheese sandwich with just a small toaster oven and a lot of patience. "A warm meal can save a cold day," her grandmother had said when Serena was only 6. She'd never forgotten those words, and tonight, as the rain began to patter steadily on the tin roof of the Lexington diner, Serena had no idea that those very words and her unhardened heart were about to open an entirely new door in her life. The rain tapped a steady rhythm on the metal awning. Outside, the faint golden glow of the Lexington diner sign blurred with each falling drop. Serena was drying her hands when her gaze froze. Just beyond the glass door, amidst the misty downpour, stood a boy. Small, thin, wrapped in a tattered jacket, his head bowed, clutching a soaked old blanket. And most striking of all, he was seated in a wheelchair. Serena's heart clenched. She pushed the door open, the cold wind biting at her. Bending down, she called softly, "Hey, kid, with weather like this, why are you out here alone?" The boy flinched, then looked up. His blue eyes shimmered with wariness, fear, and something so lonely it pierced her soul. I'm waiting for my dad. He told me to wait here." Serena glanced around. The street was deserted save for the flickering light from a pawn shop across the way. No people, no cars. "Where's your dad now?" "I don't know. Maybe he went to make a call." Serena bit her lip. The story was all too familiar. Kids left on the sidelines temporarily or permanently. "Come on, why don't you come inside with me for a bit? It's too cold out here. I make a mean sandwich, especially good on rainy nights." The boy looked at her, hesitating, then he nodded. Serena gently took his hand and wheeled him inside. The warmth of the diner enveloped them like a soft blanket. She dried his hair with a clean towel, then quickly prepared 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, the kind her grandmother used to make when she was feeling down. "I am Serena. What's your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel, that's a nice name. Go ahead and eat. It's on the house. I make this with all my heart." Daniel took a bite, then widened his eyes in surprise. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten." Serena smiled, not because of the compliment, but because a faint light had begun to flicker across the boy's face. Neither of them knew that across the street, inside a dark Bentley, a man was watching the entire scene unfold. His face was stern, his steel-sharp eyes cold, but just for a fleeting moment those eyes had softened. Raymond Holt, a billionaire in the tech industry, and Daniel's father. He'd been late to pick up his son, and instead of a simple reunion, he'd witnessed this: a poor woman in a rain-soaked apron giving his son something money couldn't buy, care. In Raymond's mind, this wasn't gratitude stirring. It was something else, a debt, and he didn't believe in kindness without reason. He believed in consequences, in prices to be paid. And Serena Carter, without realizing it, had just set in motion a game that the humble diner worker knew nothing about. The glossy black Bentley sat silently across the street, shrouded in the darkness beneath a waterlogged tree. From inside the car, the faint glow of the Lexington Diner sign reflected off the rimless glasses of the man seated in the back. Raymond Holt, 46, CEO of the East Coast's leading tech conglomerate, had once been dubbed by Forbes the man who controls cold metal with an even colder heart. He'd built his empire on discipline, strategy, and a selective indifference. Emotions, in his personal dictionary, were performance leaks. But right now, his eyes were fixed on the simple scene unfolding in the rundown diner across the way. Daniel, his son, was laughing. A rare, bright smile lit up his face, with tomato soup smudged on his cheeks and his small hands clutching a steaming sandwich. And the person making Daniel laugh was a woman Raymond had never seen before. Dark-skinned, with wild, curly hair, wearing a frayed apron. Yet her eyes held a strange gentleness, unfeigned, unaware of who he was. And that was precisely what kept Raymond's gaze locked on her. He checked his watch. He was only 27 minutes late. Daniel was supposed to wait in the escorted car with a bodyguard, but today an urgent call from Tokyo had delayed him. Daniel had begged to wait at the diner instead. Reluctantly, Raymond had agreed. Now, Daniel was sitting there, laughing with a stranger, and Raymond, a man who never let the world catch him off guard, found himself caught off guard. Nora, he picked up his phone. His voice was low and decisive. Get to the Lexington Diner, 20 minutes, no dress, no company logo, and find me everything you can about the woman who just fed my son. The line went silent for a moment before a single word came back. Understood. Raymond hung up, his eyes still glued to the rain-streaked window. He didn't believe in kindness, never had. He believed in leverage and debts, and tonight, an anonymous waitress had just made him owe her one. Serena got home just before midnight. The third-floor apartment in the old building on Fayette Street was still pitch dark, the ancient heater refusing to turn on. The walls so damp she could hear the neighbor's TV echoing through the brick. She dropped her bag on the table and rubbed her forehead. The image of Daniel lingered in her mind, his eyes as he left, that warm smile, and Sandrine, the strange woman who came to pick him up, calling herself his aunt, but with eyes too sharp and a smile too polished. Serena's instincts had long ago learned to distinguish truth from pretense in silence, and tonight something felt off. Knock, knock, knock. The sound at the door jolted her. 3 sharp, firm raps. Serena froze. No one came to her place at this hour. She crept to the door and pressed her eye to the peephole. A man, tall, broad, dressed in an expensive black coat, polished leather shoes gleaming, standing as if he owned the entire hallway. His face was stern, his gray eyes cut like a blade. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice wary. Raymond Holt. The name meant nothing to her, but his gaze, that did. "What do you want?" "To settle a debt," he replied, blunt. She cracked the door open. Raymond didn't smile. He wasn't threatening, but he wasn't friendly either. He was simply overwhelming. "I'm Daniel's father. I saw everything last night." Serena frowned. "Everything?" Raymond stepped inside as she moved aside. In her tiny kitchen under the dim light, he pulled a thick envelope from his coat and placed it on the table. "This isn't money. It's an offer." "I don't need charity," she snapped. "I don't believe in charity," he shot back, faster. "I believe in investments, and you, Serena Carter, have made me reassess my value system." She was stunned. What the hell was happening? Raymond continued, his voice cold yet steady. "I need someone like you in my company. Not someone who bows their head, but someone who can look at others with eyes that don't lie." She let out a laugh, bitter, sharp. "I'm a waitress. You live in an ivory tower. Why me? Because you saw my son, not his last name. Serena fell silent. Something inside her stirred. She glanced at the envelope. The name Holt Dynamics embossed in silver ink on thick, leather-like paper. 6 figures. I'll think about it. Raymond nodded. No pressure. But before he left, he said something that made Serena freeze in her tracks. No one owes anyone here. I just don't want a person like you to be overlooked. The door closed. Cold air seeped through the cracks. Serena looked down at her hands. They were still trembling. For the first time in years, she had a choice, and she knew the old life she'd lived had ended with that knock on the door. The Holt Dynamics building loomed like a giant block of ice in the heart of Baltimore. Cold, flawless, and dangerous. Its glass facade reflected the gray sky, stretching so high it felt as if staring too long might make you disappear into it. Serena Carter stepped through the revolving doors, wearing a blazer from a discount store and low-heeled shoes patched with glue more than once. Even so, her back was straight, her head held high. She'd served people like them before, those in perfectly tailored suits, dust-free expensive shoes, offering smiles just polite enough to dodge accountability. But today, she wasn't carrying coffee. She'd been invited. The lobby was silent as a cathedral. Each step echoed like a dare. Serena felt eyes boring into her, not because she was late, not because she was loud, but because she didn't fit. No Harvard legacy, no well-connected family in the elite circles, no introduction from another CEO. All she had was herself, and the grilled cheese sandwich she'd once made for a lonely boy. The elevator opened on the 28th floor. The executive office sprawled like a Broadway stage. Glass walls encircled it, light bouncing off every surface. A dark desk, pristine bookshelves, a leather chair without a single crease. Serena stood at the threshold, and Raymond Holt looked up just as she walked in. "You're 2 minutes late," Serena raised an eyebrow, sitting down without an apology, "because I took the stairs from the 20th floor so my legs wouldn't shake meeting you." "I think it was worth it." Raymond sat still for a second. Then he gave a slight nod, the corner of his mouth twitching in a way that could have been amusement or a warning. "Good. I don't need a shadow. I need someone who'll face the truth." The glass door slid open. Nora Winters, his assistant, stepped in, tablet in hand. Her gaze swept over Serena like she was appraising an item of unknown origin. But Serena didn't lower her head. She'd served people like Nora her whole life. She knew how to survive in spaces not built for her. Raymond spoke, no preamble. "You'll handle high-level HR negotiations, starting with Orion Group. They're proposing to cut 3,000 workers to move production overseas. I want you to stop it." Serena frowned. "For morality?" Raymond replied, "For strategy. And because I believe you know what builds a lasting empire better than quarterly reports do." Serena met his gaze head-on. Though unspoken, she knew this wasn't just a job, it was a test, and she'd passed harsher exams than this just to survive. 3 days later, Serena stood before a conference room as cold as steel, where her first challenge awaited, and the room was designed like a psychological maze. A 10-meter walnut table, sleek black leather chairs, and harsh white ceiling lights that made skin look pallid. Everything here was built to make people feel small. Raymond sat beside her, holding a pen he didn't write with, tapping it lightly on the table. Across from them were 3 men, 3 figures who looked like they'd stepped out of a prime-time financial news segment. Philip Langford, silver-haired in a hand-stitched pinstripe suit, lips pursed thin as a blade. The other 2 were younger, but their eyes were no less cutting. "We just want what's rational for the company," Langford began, his tone as calm as if he were pouring tea. "Moving production to Taiwan will save over 14% in costs in the first year. Numbers don't lie." Serena didn't argue. She just gave a faint smile. "Numbers don't lie, but customers have emotions and the press has headlines." Langford frowned. Serena continued, her voice steady as a breath. 3,000 workers laid off. The media will call it betrayal. Shareholders will call it an ethical risk. And the market will react as it always does. Panic selling. Langford leaned back, dismissive. You think you understand the market better than we do? Serena didn't answer. She slid a stack of documents across the table. An analysis of media fallout from workforce relocations over the past 5 years. Each case had consequences: plunging stocks, brand crises, consumer boycotts. I don't think, she said. I research. A beat of silence. Raymond glanced at her, saying nothing, but his hand had stopped tapping the table. Langford skimmed the report, then folded it shut, his eyes probing. Do you know what bothers me most, Miss Carter? Let's hear it. You're new. No Ivy League degree, no M&A experience. No one knows where you came from. What do you think about that? Serena leaned forward, her dark eyes flickering with fire. I think maybe that's why I see things you've stopped seeing, like the value of people, for instance. Langford sat still, no response. Minutes later, they left the room. The door closed, leaving silence behind. Raymond still said nothing, but as Serena turned to gather her papers, he spoke. For the first time that day, you just cost them a week of sleep. Serena shrugged. They should lose sleep. I've lost a year's worth just because I couldn't afford milk. Raymond paused for a beat, then gave a slight nod. Good. Keep that fire. Serena walked out of the meeting room. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. They'd started listening. A week later, Serena had just stepped out of a strategy department meeting when she saw Nora Winters waiting at the end of the hallway. Her gaze was razor sharp, though her lips curved into a perfectly measured smile. We have a problem. Serena frowned. What kind of problem? Nora didn't answer. She simply handed over a printed sheet. Serena took it. For the first few seconds, it was just words, but when her eyes hit the line forwarded from, the world tilted. A leaked email containing confidential financial data, sent to a reporter from her email address. This is fabricated, Serena said, her breath catching. I've never seen this file. I didn't send it. Nora nodded, but her eyes remained taut. I know, but others don't. The air thickened, as if the ceiling were sinking inch by inch. Serena took a deep breath, her hand crumpling the paper. She'd spent her life in systems that didn't trust women of color, where innocence was a luxury and a single baseless accusation could turn you into an outcast. Who's seen this? Serena asked. Nora replied slowly, Raymond. And the board? Serena let out a bitter laugh, not because it was funny, but because the rage inside her was clawing to break free. She marched toward the executive office. Raymond stood by the window, hands in his pockets, not turning as she entered. Say it, she rasped. I want to believe you, he said, still gazing at the distant city. Then do it. I didn't do this. Raymond turned. His face was calm, but his eyes, they held a silent storm. I believe you, but the board doesn't. Serena clenched her jaw. Convenient, isn't it? I'm the new one, the one with no roots, the easy scapegoat. Exactly, Raymond said quietly, which is why we need to move faster than they do, find out who did this before they cut you down like a pawn. Serena nodded. The panic in her eyes was gone, only fire remained. Fine, then we play to the end. Raymond picked up his phone. Nora's tracing the email, but they've covered their tracks well. Then I'll find it another way, Serena said, her hands trembling but her voice steady. I've lived in a world where every little sign could save your life. I know when someone's hiding something, and I know who at Holt Dynamics has hated me from the start. Raymond didn't smile, but his eyes glinted with something close to pride. Find them, and if you do, I'll let you handle it yourself. Serena turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. She wasn't the waitress anymore. Now, she was the hunted and the hunter. All night, Serena's office stayed lit. The computer screen glowed with a chaotic sprawl of emails, reports, access logs, user accounts, and network data trails, scattered pieces of a conspiracy. She wasn't as tech-savvy as Nora, but she was good at reading people, and one name kept resurfacing in her mind like an ink stain. Eric Calloway, Vice President of Finance, 10 years at Holt. Raymond had described him as steady but no game-changer. A man like that wouldn't take kindly to a newcomer disrupting his safe rhythm. Serena recalled their first meeting, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a typo, a speck of dust not worth wiping away. Nora stepped into the office, her hair disheveled, her coat wrinkled. "I found a lead." "What?" "The email was sent from your address, yes, but it was rerouted through an internal proxy account. That account ties back to Calloway's secondary profile." Serena didn't speak for a moment. Her heart raced, but her hands stayed steady. She opened a file on her desk and began assembling her counterattack. "He picked me because I'm vulnerable, new, no backing." Nora shrugged. "Or maybe because you're so effective you threaten him." The next day, before the board could issue a summons, Serena strode into the conference room. No one stopped her. Raymond was already seated. Calloway was there too, his expression suspiciously calm. Serena placed a stack of documents on the table. "Before you decide to make me the sacrificial lamb, I think you should read this." She opened the file, sliding pages forward. Forwarded emails, IP addresses, login histories, bank statements with shady transactions, even a recording of an internal conversation Nora had skillfully recovered. Calloway shot to his feet. "This is a fabrication. There's no way." Raymond cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Sit down and call your lawyer." No one said another word. Serena stood tall, her eyes unblinking. For the first time since stepping into Holt Dynamics, she owned this room, and this time she was the one rewriting the script. Monday 9, the 35th floor conference room was packed with high-end suits, silk ties, and eyes that had already convicted Serena before she even stepped inside. The door swung open. Serena Carter, no assistant, no lawyer, no support, walked in alone, like a storm gathering itself. She held a thick stack of files, her gaze unwavering. Raymond Holt was already there, seated silently at the head of the table, hands clasped. He didn't nod, didn't signal, but his look said, "Today, the power is yours." "Miss Carter, please take a seat," a board member said, his voice so polite it dripped with pretense. Serena didn't sit. She opened her file, pulling out evidence piece by piece, sweeping the room as if every doubting stare fueled the fire in her chest. "Before you continue discussing suspension, I think there are a few details we need to clear up." She laid out each piece of evidence like flipping the final card. In a high-stakes game, forged email logs, internal IP data pointing to Calloway's computer, a recorded call with a reporter, shady bank transactions, and finally the audio, Calloway's voice discussing how to clear the path by taking Serena down. No one spoke. Calloway shot to his feet, his face ashen. "This is a breach of privacy." Raymond cut him off, his voice smooth as a blade slicing cloth. "This is evidence of a crime." He stood, slowly, stepping to the head of the table. "Effective immediately, Eric Calloway is stripped of all access. An internal lawsuit will be filed with legal within the hour. And if any of you think this can be handled quietly," he paused, "I suggest you read tomorrow's paper." Calloway was escorted out. Serena remained still. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just stood in silence, like a storm that had just broken. Another board member hesitated. "Miss Carter, if I recall correctly, you've been with the company less than 3 months. Serena nodded. "True, but I've spent a lifetime in systems that wanted me silent, so when I get a chance to speak, I don't waste it." Raymond smiled. For the first time, it wasn't cold, not strategic. It was approving. "Meeting adjourned," he said. The conference room door closed behind Serena, and with that click, an older version of herself was left behind. 3 months later, the new office bore a gleaming brass plaque. Serena Carter, Vice President of Social Strategy, Holt Dynamics. Serena gazed at it, not with pride but with a quiet sense of peace, because she knew this wasn't the result of a backroom handshake or a stroke of luck from above. It came from a life that had taught her how to stand tall, alone, without anyone pointing the way. Under her leadership, Holt Dynamics had just launched the Bridge program, partnering with community organizations to create hundreds of jobs for those the system had once discarded. Single mothers, people of color, ex-convicts, individuals with disabilities. On the ground floor, the first social enterprise cafe sponsored by Holt had opened its doors, staffed by the very workers who had nearly been laid off by Langford. At the press conference, a reporter posed a question: what makes you believe that people society has pushed aside can make a difference? Serena simply smiled. Because I'm one of them, and I know that when they're given a real chance, not charity, they don't just survive, they rebuild the very system that once crushed them. Raymond stood at the back of the room, clapping silently. As the meeting wrapped up, Serena spotted Daniel, now dressed in a high school uniform, waiting for her in the lobby. He waved, holding a soda can in his other hand. "I think you'll like this news," he said. He handed her a sheet of paper, full scholarship offer. Serena's voice caught in her throat. Daniel stepped closer and said softly, "If you hadn't given me that sandwich that night, I probably wouldn't be here." Serena hugged him, tears falling without warning, because now she understood. Every act of kindness carries consequences, and sometimes those consequences are beautiful. 5 years later, Serena stood before a vast auditorium where hundreds of students were graduating from the Carter Holt Foundation's training program, a scholarship fund named after her, and a man who once didn't believe in kindness, Daniel, now a law student, was introducing her as the woman who changed my life with just a meal and a little faith. Serena stepped onto the stage. The lights blazed, but she didn't tremble. She had trembled in far darker places, and now this light didn't burn her, it lifted her. "I'm not here to talk about success," she began. "I'm here to talk about failure, about pain, about being invisible, until you force the world to see you." The room fell silent. "I was once a nameless waitress, a black woman in a leaking apartment. But I learned how to stand, not because someone held me up, but because I realized that every time I chose kindness, I was rewriting what it means to be human." The applause erupted like thunder, but in Serena's heart there was only one sound, a steady heartbeat, the rhythm of someone who had completed one journey, only to embark on another, bigger, deeper, the journey of someone once deemed unworthy, who became the one to reshape the system itself.